Welcome to Innovation in Government. I'm Jason Miller. My guest today is Joel Jackson, the Senior Director of Emerging Product Sales for Red Hat North America Public Sector. Joel, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get started, let me set some context for our discussion. The general acceptance of cloud and the implementation of DevSecOps culture is opening doors for the next evolution across government. The use of microservices and automation are helping agencies move faster, more efficiently as they develop software and services with their vendor partners. The Food and Drug Administration, take them as an example. One of the first agencies to take advantage of microservices and move away from what they called a center-centric support model to one where there's teams focused on products or capabilities. Another example is the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service. They're leading the way with automation. USCIS is deploying code through an immutable process to get that code into a cloud environment on an hourly or even daily basis. And over at the Homeland Security Department, the CIO's office is building something they're calling a cloud factory. The idea will support the ability for agencies to build, test, deploy software, code through the DevOps approach, and quickly improve operational and mission applications. These are but just three examples of how agencies are taking advantage of new development techniques to celebrate their IT modernization efforts and open the door a bit wider for innovation. And that's where my guest comes in. Once again, Joel Jackson, the Senior Director for Emerging Product Sales at Red Hat North America Public Sector Group. You're going to tell us about how cloud, automation, microservices, and other processes are underpinning federal IT modernization efforts. So let's start at maybe the beginning. We've talked about DevOps for quite a while. We've talked about microservices for a couple of years. Where are we at, if you will, with these concepts? Are they part of the culture? Are they becoming part of the culture? Give me a sense.
Right, so I think even a couple years ago I was on with you guys about microservices and how that was a new paradigm shift, if you will, on how to develop applications. So instead of developing a very large monolithic application, hard to change, kind of use the waterfall approach for that, which has been around for a couple decades in the federal government. Now you move to a very agile, sprinting microservices where you break up that monolithic application into maybe a couple thousand microservices, and then if you need to change, you just change one of those microservices instead of trying to change the entire thing. So I think that concept, microservices, is I would say well established. It's not a new concept. There are some customers that are looking to explore in that, but I would say the majority they understand what it is, they just don't know how to implement that inside their agency. So I think the biggest challenge now when it comes to microservices is the culture part. It's not a technology problem. There's a lot of tools. Red Hat has tools that help you enable microprocesses and develop and give you guardrails to make sure that you stay within those lanes. But yeah, changing how the federal and state and local governments develop software culturally is a huge problem, and it's probably the biggest area that we spend our time on. Is here's how you become a Netflix inside of a federal agency or a state and local agency, and here's the type of developers you need to have. Here's the type of processes and controls that you need to have and tooling to help you with that cultural change.
And when you talk about culture change, is that because people have to understand how the DevOps culture, the microservices work, or is it more of, wait a minute, I have to stop doing this waterfall approach, or I have to know what I'm going to get up front? Like, what's the culture that has to change?
Yeah, I think everything that you just said. So even let's start from the beginning on planning. DoD is a great example. They take 5 years to plan a system. That just isn't realistic today. By the time that gets out, and you go through the waterfall deployment or development, by the time it gets to the warfighter, it's kind of an obsolete, and you might have to change it 100 times. So what do? So instead of doing that from the process of implementing, the start of development, you want to have a sprinting capability right off the mindset on how you're going to get features into a product from the get-go versus how do you change features after a 5-year waterfall development approach. So that's the first part, I think, is the planning. That's difficult for the federal government because a lot of them still buy the way they buy tanks and ships, which is very long lead times and very little change. So there's certainly some agencies, like DHS, some in DoD that are doing very, very well at this, and they're implementing some agile approaches to enabling microservices into their development process. So, from the planning part to the development part, and then operationally, I think that also requires a lot of cultural change. How do you maintain systems that are changing faster, right? You've got all these certifications typically that, the monolithic applications used to have to go through, and if you're just changing one component of that now, do you have to do, different certifications and stuff like that? So there's a whole gamut of cultural change, I would say, from the inception of a program to how you operationalize it and sustain it when it's in production. So it's not just a cultural change on the development part, which I think is your point. It's the cultural change across the whole life cycle of an application.
And now we're starting to hear about this new concept, or I'm not sure how new it is, called Kubernetes. It's a concept that I think has come up time and again, but explain maybe what that is and then how that kind of relates back to this idea of microservices and
Sure. So Kubernetes is a technology. It was developed inside of Google, and taking it a couple steps back. So you had containers that became all the rage on the scene maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and it's conveniently people left off the first word of containers. It's a Linux container. So when we talked about containers, which was the ability for developers to spin up sandboxes of development environments really quickly, and they were portable. So that was a very cool concept that took off. All of a sudden you had, in a development organization, you would have thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of containers floating around your IT system. So the next big challenge was, okay, how do I manage all these containers and orchestrate them? And lo and behold, Google open sourced this thing called Kubernetes that they had built for how they did and manage their containers. And I think they had a stat that they used to do they would spin up and kill about 3 billion Linux containers a week at Google. So who better to manage 3 billion? The scale that they had was really impressive. So obviously the market reacted, okay, well, these guys probably know what they're talking about for that. So they took this open source project called Kubernetes. Red Hat quickly jumped on that. We were the first, besides Google, to really jump on that and productize a enterprise version of Kubernetes. And so now Kubernetes allows you to orchestrate all these containers. It's become I would say, the de facto tool for managing and orchestrating, these containers that are everywhere.
And the containers, just let me interrupt real quick, are these microservices in many ways, where as I'm building a software tool or a citizen services, and each of the functionalities that I need can be in a container, and that's the management part, or am I conflating?
That's fair, right? You would have microservices inside of containers, and you would orchestrate them with Kubernetes to meet the overall mission of what your application was supposed to do. So Kubernetes is, again, I think a couple years ago we're the number 2 committer to. It's an open source project, so Google's number 1, we're number 2, and we productize the first enterprise Kubernetes solution. It's called OpenShift from Red Hat, and Kubernetes is the de facto standard. So now you see everybody moving to a Kubernetes-based solution, even hardware partners. All the public cloud providers now have a Kubernetes solution because it can be the one thing that stays the same while everything else changes, which is, a lot of the promise that Linux gave back in the day where, you could write your application in Red Hat Enterprise Linux and you could swap out your hardware partners, whether it's HP, Dell, what have you, whoever gave you the best deal. That's kind of the promise on Kubernetes too, is if you write your applications to a Kubernetes layer, let's say called OpenShift, and then you might be able to compete your cloud provider in the future, because the public cloud providers are becoming, they all have different use cases, and Google might be a great use case if you're developing an AI or an artificial intelligence or machine learning app. Amazon, obviously everybody knows what they're doing with their cloud native stuff. So when you're building an app, you might want to target a different public cloud provider, and writing it once to Kubernetes, a platform like OpenShift, allows you to move that to different cloud providers without rewriting all your code.
And that's the reason behind that, is because you're taking that container and you're just the old lift and shift, but in a good way.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely I think the evolution of cloud is find a PaaS, a platform as a service, then that's your new application development. Lift and shift your current stuff that can be moved over to your PaaS, and then you're going to automate the rest. So those are the 3 steps we see a lot of federal agencies wrestling with. How do you get to cloud? Those are the 3 types of things. You buy a container platform, you start developing on that as your new stuff, then you lift and shift what you can, which is what you just said, over to the container platform, and then you try and automate the rest that can't get over.
I want to definitely go down the path of cloud, but you also brought up automation. And where does automation fit into the microservices and Kubernetes discussion?
Well, you want to automate what you can, but you obviously have to be careful on. You don't want to automate dumb things, right? So if you make mistakes, you don't want to automate that. From an automation perspective, it started. I think the big rage was around server automation. Now it's a network automation. So you have all these infrastructure level automating tools. We have one called Ansible. That is probably our second hottest product, and it's around server automation, network automation, so you can take the humans out of the loop for installing all your software on servers, which used to take a long time, and the same is applying to the network side now.
It reminds me a little bit of the software-defined network that's we hear a lot about, and then automation comes in during the microservices too, where we're automating security checks or we're automating certain requirements to say, does the software meet a certain set of requirements or standards for the code level? Is that also where you guys are seeing some automation?
Yep, that's right. So whenever you have, when you can automate checks, like to your point, security checks or configuration checks. I mean, you look at a lot of the hacks that happen out there in the public commercial world. Usually it's because they didn't update a system, right? Maybe they didn't update a browser, or they just forgot. And it was on the list to do it, but they just didn't get it done. Maybe there was a human in the loop and it just took too long for them to get to it. But automation allows you to get this out and patch stuff really quickly, security, configs. There's also, the ability for automation, and not just in the IT world, but automation even in the consumer world is going to be a really big deal, because you can get a lot of stuff done quicker with a lot less humans in the loop.
You brought up cloud earlier because one of the things that Kubernetes and containerization allows you is to take what you've developed under cloud A, you want to move it to cloud B, you can lift up that container and move it to the next cloud. And that actually fits into the broader discussion about the reason why we can talk microservices, why we can talk containerization, is because of this broader acceptance to the cloud. And really, I'll even go down the path of the move to hybrid cloud. How has the cloud opened that door for all this kind of, we'll call it emerging technologies that's not so emerging anymore?
Right. So I think it all started with Linux. If you look at the cloud providers today, the big three public cloud providers today, what's the one OS they push more than anything, including Microsoft's public cloud? It's Linux. And there's a reason for that. It's proven, it's enterprise reliable, it's secure. So if the benefit of having a Linux platform be the _1 default choice for the public cloud providers, and everything that we've done with Red Hat on the enterprise side, on the on-prem side with Linux, that's a big win for containers, because again, containers are Linux containers. So the ability to move, portable the ability to have applications be portable starts with Linux, moves on to containers because it's built on a rock solid foundation like a Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and then you can move that application around to different cloud providers, whether that's an on-premise cloud that you've built with Red Hat, or some of our competitors as well, or you go to run the application on the public cloud, whether that's Amazon, Google, or Microsoft. Usually you're using a Linux container or workload, and there's a lot of benefit to that that the container ecosystem gets that the Linux ecosystem gives it.
At the same time, agencies and other organizations are not going to solely be in one type of cloud, a public cloud, and there's going to have that hybrid. Right. So that also allows that, if you will, the organization, the agency have a foot in both sides. Right.
We think, if you take a look at an application, you could take Netflix for example, right? They started on Amazon. Great for them. They've obviously maxed out every single thing they can do on that. But what if they wanted to take advantage of a machine learning or an artificial intelligence, workload? Maybe Google has a better solution on their cloud. So that's, do you want to have a multi-cloud experience? And that's one of the things that we push is, do you want to have a multi-cloud experience plus a hybrid cloud experience? Let me just define those two for a second. So multi-cloud is, for us, is to have our software and experience as a user be the same across multi-cloud. So if you're going to use a public cloud A versus public cloud B, if you're using our software, we want it to be the same experience. If you get into the hybrid cloud world, which is what we see, and probably one of the reasons we're being acquired, probably the number one reason we're being acquired, that's the ability to use a workload on-prem and also in the public cloud, and how many workloads are going to stay on-prem versus how many are going to go into the public cloud. And there's a lot of competing theories on that. The public cloud guys didn't even believe in hybrid cloud or private cloud as of 3 years ago. But we think it's certainly got a lot of legs, and you can see which way those guys are investing in. They're all coming onto a hybrid cloud sales motion, and they're even building hardware in people's data centers, which was unheard of 3 years ago.
Very good. On that point, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we can continue our conversation. You're listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carasoft on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network.